there everyone. This is part 2 of the 2.01 Growing Tension lesson read aloud. So we were on the textbook reading, so let's finish that up. Starting with the Stamp Act crisis. In 1765, Grenville prodded Parliament into passing two other laws that profoundly upset the colonists. The first, the Quartering Act, required colonial assemblies to pay for the housing, food, and drink of British troops stationed in North America. The colonists, who saw no need to station army troops in their cities, balked at this new expense. When the New York Assembly refused to pay for barracks to house the largest garrison in Manhattan, the royal governor was ordered by Parliament to stop approving other legislation until the Assembly agreed to pay for the soldiers' quarters. The second law Grenville pushed in 1765 was the Stamp Act, which required colonists to buy special stamps to place on almost every piece of printed paper they used for business: legal documents, newspapers, deeds, pamphlets, even playing cards. This sort of tax was common in England, but new to the colonies. The Stamp Act was Parliament's first attempt to directly tax American colonists. With the Stamp Act, Parliament was not attempting to regulate trade, but was trying to raise money from the American colonists to help pay down Britain's debts. The Stamp Act met with fierce colonial resistance, partly for economic reasons. The colonists had developed a complex economy heavily dependent on written documents such as promissory notes, contracts, and the ream of legal documents used by litigious, I can't say that, people that wanted to sue. Literate as well as legitimists. I'm sorry, you're just going to go to pronounce that someplace else. I just trip my tongue on it every time. The colonists sustained the tradition of their ancestors, who often expressed their opinions and disagreements in pamphlets or other written proclamations. Colonial printers published hundreds of newspapers. The Stamp Act would demand a payment for each and all of those documents. But the loud protests against the Stamp Act were not mainly about money. Rather, said the colonists, this new tax was an unacceptable assault on their liberty. What did taxes have to do with liberty? Since the time of the Glorious Revolution, Englishmen had asserted their natural right, as John Locke phrased it, life, liberty, and property. As most Englishmen of the time saw it, taxing was a way of taking away one's property. If a king could take away his people's property without their consent, then what was to stop the king from taking everything and effectively reducing the people to slavery? The English Bill of Rights stated that Englishmen could be taxed only by their parliament, where they had representatives. For 120 years, the American colonists had regarded their colonial assemblies as their own form of parliament. The elected colonial assemblies passed colonial taxes. John Adams, a young Massachusetts lawyer with a bright future ahead, insisted that we take it clearly to be inconsistent with the fundamental principles of the British Constitution that we should be subject to any tax imposed by the British Parliament because we are not represented in that body in any sense. The Stamp Act Congress. The hearty opposition to the Stamp Act was led by two politically active and informed groups that relied heavily on print: journalists and lawyers. In cities and towns throughout the colonies, fiery editorials and impassioned speeches stirred angry citizens to confront tax officials and demand they hand over their stamps. In some cities and towns, mobs destroyed the homes of tax officials. Many courts and some newspapers shut down in protest rather than pay the stamp tax. In a widely distributed pamphlet titled Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, James Otis, the Massachusetts lawyer who had cried out against taxation without representation, declared the stamp tax unconstitutional and absolutely irreconcilable with the rights of the colonists as British subjects and men. In Virginia, Patrick Henry persuaded the House of Burgesses to pass a resolution asserting their sole exclusive right to tax Virginia citizens. John Adams agreed in the Boston Gazette. We have always understood it to be a grand and fundamental principle of the British Constitution that no free man should be subject to any tax to which he has not given his own consent. 9 colonial assemblies were so outraged by the Stamp Act that they sent 27 delegates to a Stamp Act Congress in New York City. The delegates drew up a list of their rights and grievances and petitioned King George and Parliament to repeal the law. Stunned by the force of the American response, Parliament did repeal the Stamp Act. But then Parliament tried to save face by passing legislation asserting its right to tax the colonies. To the members of Parliament, this seemed only fair. After all, Britain had just fought, and was still struggling to pay for, a war to defend the colonies. Moreover, 10,000 British troops were stationed in North America to protect the colonists. Why should the citizens of London, Bristol, and Manchester be expected to foot the bill for defending and maintaining these faraway colonies? Parliament expected the colonists to pay only one-third of the cost of military defense. Even that one-third was unacceptable to most colonists, on the principle of no taxation without representation. Still, the taxes kept coming. Charles the Townshend Acts. Charles Townshend, Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, the agency in charge of collecting and managing the empire's revenues, devised what he thought would be a simpler way to get money out of the colonists. He proposed sorry, I need to try to do better at reading. Let me slow down. He proposed imposing duties at colonial ports on glass, lead, paper, paints, and tea. Townshend reasoned that the colonists would accept these taxes more readily if they had the Stamp than they had the Stamp Act, because the duties would be collected from merchants while going through customs before the goods actually entered the colonies to be sold. As Townshend saw it, the duties were very much like the Navigation Acts that the colonists had previously accepted. Yet these new tariffs were designed to raise revenue, not regulate trade, but after the Stamp Act controversy, perhaps the colonists would pass over such a fine point. Parliament liked the scheme, and in 1767 passed what became known in the colonies as the Townshend Acts. By this time, the colonists, having sharpened their arguments on principles of taxation, were ready to oppose any tax coming from England. They saw the Townshend Acts as duties as taxes, not tariffs, and worse, taxes that had not been approved by the colonists or their assemblies. In his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, a lawyer named John Dickinson advised colonists to reject. And let me go. That's just a Liberty song from John Dickinson that we're reading about here. To reject the Townshend duties and boycott, which means refuse to buy British goods. Dickinson did not dispute the right of the mother country to regulate trade, but he fumed, never did the British Parliament till the period above mentioned think of imposing duties in America for the purpose of raising a revenue. The Townshend Acts, said Dickinson, were unconstitutional and destructive to the liberty of these colonies, but he was careful to suggest no disrespect toward the mother country. Let us behave like dutiful children who have received unmerited blows from a beloved parent, he wrote. Most colonists liked the idea of a boycott. Merchants agreed, sometimes under pressure, not to import items from England, such as tea or fine cloth. Some colonial women set up spinning wheels in town squares. It became fashionable to wear homespun clothing on the streets of Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. English merchants who had grown to depend on American customers hated the boycott. They pressured Parliament into repealing all the Townshend duties except for the one on tea. Many colonists continued to boycott the taxed tea, although quite a few cheated because even when taxed, British tea was cheaper than tea smuggled in from other countries. Liberty, taxes, and tyranny. To revisit the question posed earlier, what did taxes have to do with liberty? Everything, said the American colonists. To the colonists, new taxes were nothing less than an oppressive exercise of power by the British government, in short, a kind of tyranny. Colonial leaders reasoned thus: if Parliament, in which the colonists had no representatives, could tax the colonists without limit and without their consent, then what was to stop Parliament from taking away all their property? In effect, said the colonists to Parliament, if you take away one of our fundamental rights, then you open the door to taking away all. This possibility, they argued, amounted to tyranny in its most fundamental level. In some colonies, leading merchants, lawyers, and planters formed groups called Sons of Liberty to declare their opposition to tyranny. One of these Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams, started a committee of correspondence that sent letters to leaders in other colonies to alert them to the latest threats to liberty in his hometown of Boston. Soon other concerned colonists from Philadelphia to Savannah set up their own committees of correspondence. Committee members composed and shared a steadily growing pile of grievances against the British government for the violation of their liberties. Fighting begins. Sam Adams' home, the port city of Boston, was becoming a hotbed of protest. In Parliament's opinion, the city needed careful watching. To prevent smuggling, the British government set up a new board of customs commissioners in Boston. The commissioners routinely seized ships and levied heavy fines against their owners. When Boston merchants protested, the commissioners called for help. England responded by sending 2 extra regiments of British troops to Boston. Bostonians would have resented these soldiers even if they had behaved as perfect gentlemen, but they did not. They swaggered through the streets, arrogant and sometimes drunk. Boston residents ridiculed the redcoats or regulars at first behind their backs, but increasingly to their faces. A clash seemed inevitable. The Boston Massacre. On the cold evening of March 5th, 1770, several men and boys were taunting a lone British sentry as he stood on duty near the customs house in Boston. Other people joined in the heckling. Soon more soldiers arrived to back up the beleaguered sentry, and an ugly street brawl erupted. Hundreds of colonists gathered, taunting and pelting the 9 soldiers with snowballs, chunks of ice, sticks, and oyster shells. The British officer in charge insisted that he gave no order, but the soldiers fired into the crowd, and 5 colonists were killed. The first casualty, Crispus Atticus, was a black sailor and former slave. News of what colonists called the Boston Massacre spread quickly. It was the first time that the British troops had opened fire on fellow British colonists. When 8 of the soldiers were charged with murder, and no lawyer would take the case, John Adams, a principled lawyer from the nearby town of Braintree, agreed to defend the soldiers. Adams was a strong supporter of American liberty. Indeed, he had written to denounce the Stamp Act in the Boston Gazette, but insisted all Englishmen had the right to legal defense, and he was no friend to mobs. He argued to the jury that the crowd had provoked the soldiers, who then fired in self-defense. He was so persuasive that the 6 British soldiers were found not guilty by an American colonial jury, and 2 were convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter. From the Tea Party to the Intolerable Acts. Perhaps nothing angered the colonists so much as the continuing tax on tea. This tax, as the colonists saw it, was Parliament's stubborn way of asserting its right to tax the colonies. To add insult to injury, the British government announced that it was giving the British East India Tea Company an exclusive monopoly on tea business in the colonies. The decision excluded independent colonial merchants and shippers from the tea trade. Most colonists worried it opened the doors to more government-mandated monopolies that would favor British businesses and put colonial businesses at a severe disadvantage. Sam Adams and other Sons of Liberties condemned the monopoly as another British violation of the colonists' rights. Many colonists called for a boycott of British tea. In colonial ports, when the East India Company's ships arrived fully loaded, angry colonists often forced the ships to turn around and sail back to England. In port cities along the Atlantic coast, some colonists held tea parties in which they burned or dumped shipments of British tea. The most famous tea party took place in Boston when, on an icy December night in 1773, a band of colonists disguised as Indians quietly boarded the 3 British tea ships. They split open 342 chests of tea and dumped 90,000 pounds of the valuable cargo into Boston Harbor. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, an outraged Parliament decided that Boston and the entire colony of Massachusetts must be punished. Parliament swiftly passed the Coercive Acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The acts included the Boston Port Act, which closed the city's harbor, not only preventing trade, but also cutting off needed supplies that came by ship. Another act stripped the colony of its charter, abolished town meetings, and gave the appointed royal governor much more power. A new quartering act expanded the old law that had required colonies to provide barracks for soldiers. It said government officials could now take over any unused building and lodge British troops in it. Parliament hoped that by making an example of Boston, they would get other American colonies to pay attention and learn better than to disregard British laws. The colonists certainly paid attention. Through committees of correspondence and a furiously active American press, they spread the word about what was happening in Massachusetts. On June 1st, 1774, the day the British closed Boston's port, Philadelphians closed their businesses to show their solidarity with their northern neighbors, while in Philadelphia's harbor, American vessels lowered their flags to half-mast. From as far away as Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina, colonists sent food and other supplies to Boston. The supplies from Virginia's Fairfax County were sent for the benefit and relief of those who, by the late cruel act of Parliament, are deprived of their daily bread and labor, to keep that manly spirit which made them dear to every American. Dear to every American, the words capture the evolution of colonial identity over the course of little more than a decade. The colonists who once tended to ignore what went on outside the borders of their individual colonies were beginning to understand that they had more in common with each other than with the British across the sea. Okay, and that's at the end of our page. So make sure you complete the French and War online activity, which if we get the page to turn here, we should be able to find it. Okay, come on, little class. Nope, did we go too far? Okay, it's just spinning here. Okay, so complete the French and Indian War activity. So you got a little activity that pops up. Make sure you go through the prompts and complete it to the end. Then these are optional things you can watch, not required. just optional if you're interested. And then make sure you complete the 201 checkpoint and have your reading guide done. That's all. Good luck.